Tonight's guest speaker is Brother David Musa Pidcock. He has spoken here before, and I think many of you were here when he spoke a few months back on Napoleon and the Code Napoleon and the roots of interest and rigor within our system. Just a recap on who he is. He's a political activist, a writer, and monetary reformer. His specialisms include political economy, rational economics, Islamic banking, local exchange trading systems. The list sort of carries on. He's among his publications was 1992 Satanic Voices, Ancient and Modern, definitive reply to Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses, and his arranging publication of Napoleon and Islam, 1999. This recent book is called Propaganda in the Next War, which is based on the original book by Sidney Rogerson.
Yeah.
And tonight's talk is going to basically look at this idea of propaganda and how the whole propaganda machine works, primarily in terms of getting the general public to agree to certain situations that happen, which us as Muslims are very outraged by at the moment. So it will give you a sense of understanding their system and their ideas. So without any hesitation, I'm going to hand over to Musa Pidcock.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invite. Normally I don't get invited back more than once, as they say. But this issue of propaganda, of course, we've all seen what's been happening over the last few months, that now the Muslims have become public enemy number one, and unfortunately there seems to be no response from our side to address the balance. What over the years I've been trying, amongst other brothers and some sisters who reverted to Islam, for the want of a better description, is to really see, well, why should we accept the status quo? Why don't we do something? Why don't we try and go on the offensive in the sense that we should be putting on the agenda the fact that we have no democracy after the last American election that even Gaddafi said he was prepared to send observers to. We don't have any. We have certainly no justice, as I discovered many years ago. So we have, the agenda has been set by others, and we have really to go on the offensive with the factual information that enables us to win hearts and minds. Now, this particular book, it's not the original cover, but this book was published originally in 1938 it was written by Captain Sidney Rogerson. Now, nobody really knows about Captain Sidney Rogerson, and that's our first mistake. He was a very important individual. He was, at the time, the publicity manager for the Federation of British Industry, which was known in those days as the FBI, but not the J. Edgar Hoover variety, but which was now the CBI. He was also the publicity controller for ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries. Then I think the world's largest chemical company, and certainly not a small fry now. But his major role was publicity and public relations advisor to the Army Council, War Office, London. So the guy who put this together was not a loony lefty. He was an extremely intelligent individual and understood human nature better than probably anybody in recent times. The book describes how we will plan, how we will carry out propaganda in the next war. So sitting in the City of London, or in its environs, there was this group. There were 8 volumes in this series. Some of them regarding, they were sea power in the next war, air power in the next war, propaganda in the next war, this volume. Tanks in the next war, infantry in the next war, gas in the next war, the territorial army in the next war, and the civilian in the next war. And these were, I think they were restricted circulation. But obviously it wasn't restricted to the extent that an American congressman read this book and warned Congress that what the British were planning. And this is a statement from the Congressional Record, April the 25th, 1939, and recorded in the Congressional Record of the 76th Congress. The page numbers and everything are here. And Senator Nye of North Dakota said, there has been published a series of works under the title The Next War. One of the volumes in this series is entitled Propaganda in the Next War. This particular volume was written by one Sidney Rogerson. Now, he knew nothing about his background, so he said he knows nothing about his background, but the editor-in-chief of all these works, including the one entitled Propaganda in the Next War, is none other than Captain Basil Littlehart. Now, Littlehart was the Times, worked with the Times. He was the military expert for small arms and infantry. He was a renowned world figure in military matters. And so Senator Nye goes on to say, a man who is, his name is recognised the world over as an authority in Great Britain. He is none other than Captain Littlehart, associated with the Times of London, a writer and military authority in Europe. The following are quotations from this authority, and he quotes, "To persuade her, the United States, to take our part the next time will be much more difficult. So difficult as to be unlikely to succeed. It will need a definite threat to America, a threat, moreover, which will have to be brought home by propaganda if America is to come into another external quarrel. The position will naturally be considerably eased if Japan were involved, and this might and would probably bring America in without further ado. At any rate, it will be a natural and obvious object of our propagandists to achieve this, just as during the Great War they succeeded in embroiling the United States with Germany. For some time the issue as to which side the United States would take hung in the balance, and the final result was a credit to our propaganda. There remained the Jews. It had been estimated that of the world's Jewish population of approximately 15 million, no fewer than 5 million are in the United States. 25% of the inhabitants of New York are Jews. During the Great War, we bought off this huge American Jewish public with the promise of the Jewish national home in Palestine, held by General Ludendorff to have been the masterstroke of Allied propaganda, as it enabled us not only to appeal to the Jews in America, but to the Jews in Germany as well. So, in 1917, when we were losing the war, about to lose the war, Churchill, at the instigation of Weizmann, basically they had the Balfour Declaration drafted to save us from losing the war. We then arranged for an American ship to be sent called the Lusitania, and of course that was the pretext in which America came in. But the preparations were already there, but we were losing, so we promised Palestine, as we did Northern Ireland. Of course, as I've said recently, like in Northern Ireland, that the English can't remember what the Irish can't forget, and likewise in Palestine, and they shouldn't forget, because this was a monumental injustice which was seeing the ramifications, and many Jews opposed it. In fact, most of the Orthodox Jewish community in London opposed the Balfour Declaration. Some demonstrated, and there was quite a to-do, but of course the deal was, the agenda was that Palestine was the thing that was given away in exchange for saving the empire. The idea that Japan would be used, of course, came to pass. As Roosevelt said, nothing happens by accident. Muslims tend to use the system of IBM to do their planning, which is Inshallah, Bukhara, or Filmishmish, or Malish. And that's no good in this game. On the 25th of November, to show that this in actual fact came to pass, that the cabinet in the White House was sitting, and Roosevelt was actually in office, and Secretary of State for War Stimson makes this announcement or this declaration or this admission in his diaries for November the 25th, 1941. Secretary Stimson, according to Charles Beard, in his book President Roosevelt and the Coming War of 1941, a study in appearances and realities, Yale University Press, points out that Secretary Stimson was, and I quote, a leading and pertinacious actor in the affairs of the time, and who wrote in his diary for November 25th, 1941, then at 12 o'clock, General Marshall and I went to the White House, where we were until nearly 1:30. At the meeting were Hull, Knox, Stark and myself. The President, instead of bringing up the victory parade, this was an office nickname or euphemism for the General Staff Strategic Plan of National Action in case of war in Europe, brought up the event that we were likely to be attacked perhaps as soon as next Monday. For the Japanese are notorious for making an attack without warning. And the question was what we should do. The question was how we should manoeuvre them into firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. So Roosevelt's speech, the Day of Infamy, was written actually a day before the attack. And so we see here that this outrage, the pretext, was in actual fact already prepared, because the agenda was something that nobody is really aware of. The agenda was to bring about world government in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the key to the whole thing, but it's not apparent at this stage to many of us. In Miles Copeland's autobiography called The Game Player, now Miles Copeland is important for Muslims to know about because he was the main political operative in the Middle East. He engineered the toppling of Mossadegh's government after the democratically held election in Iran that brought the wrong person to power. And Copeland was in actual fact a very important actor in knowing, and we should understand what he was up to. But in his autobiography he says that when his boss, the head of the CIA, was an admiral called Sidney Sowers, went to see President Truman, when Sowers promised that America would never again suffer an attack like Pearl Harbor, Truman said, obviously you haven't received your secret briefing, otherwise you would know, or have known, that the President Roosevelt got the intelligence and decided to let Pearl Harbor attack happen as a way of arousing an otherwise apathetic populace. So here the guy, we're learning that the appearances are entirely different to the realities. The power of propaganda has been used throughout history, but probably one of the most important events that, and the quote from it will last, I think, throughout history, is Randolph Hearst when he received the report from Havana in Cuba, and ironically Cuba's once again in the news. He was cabled to Hearst that war was unlikely. There are two replies Hearst, his reporter, had made. One, he said, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war, or you furnish the headlines and I'll furnish the war. So the idea of the picture, the outrage, is then, as he said, that we don't report the war, we don't report news, we actually invent it. So this was, again, the press using a pretext or using an outrageous photograph like the pictures from Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, but that achieved it. Now, that throughout the last century, and also in this century now, this was another release from the National Security Archives last year, and the American Freedom of Information Act. We have a Freedom from Information Act, if you probably noticed. And this is what was going on in 1962 with the Joint Chiefs of Staff at that time, the same firm basically. From 1942 1962, we've now got just the next batch. We have a change of shift, not a change of really management. They were saying then, the American Chiefs of Staff, we could blow up a US ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. Casualty lists in the US newspapers could cause a helpful wave of indignation. We could shoot down a CIA plane designed to look like a passenger flight and announce that the Cuban forces had shot it down. So that, again, is the same people, just an earlier group, who have used outrage to justify their actions. Now, for Muslims, or for people, I mean, most people would be outraged at finding out that, like, I lost a cousin in the last World War and a grandfather in the First World War, but they all went to fight on the pretext that they were actually defending the country. In the meeting that I had with Miles Copeland, and his admissions are very important, particularly for the Middle East. in his book, The Game Player, having admitted that he basically was very much involved with propaganda, he admits that basically that he was the one who was in control of all Gamal Abdel Nasser's speeches during the entire period of Nasser's being in office were written by the American CIA to make it appear that Egypt or Nasser's regime were anti-American. That was just the facade, the disguise to show, certainly for Anthony Eden, who was almost beside himself with madness. But the reports that were done in conjunction with Copeland and Nasser. So they were protecting him, but who would have thought that that Gamal Abdel Nasser was working 100% for the Americans? Most of the Arab leaders, or the people now you speak to in the Gulf, are coming to the conclusion that that may be true, but it's very difficult. But we should realise that this is the way the game's been played, and we have been extremely foolish in allowing other people to do our work. What Copeland said, just to quote from him correctly, he said, "And now I must make an even more arresting admission. While the Straits in Washington were increasingly displeased with the anti-American content of Nasser's public utterances and the anti-American propaganda that poured out of Radio Cairo, the Middle East's most far-reaching medium, can you guess who was writing a goodly portion of the material? We were. We understood, as Nasser did at that time, that the new regime's hold on the country depended on it being consistently and convincingly anti-American, and that Nasser couldn't even risk an indication of reasonableness towards us, to our various Middle Eastern policies. We took pains to make it subtly counterproductive, but of course, and we included a lot of patent nonsense, but virtually we kept in control of its production throughout." So he said in a later point, and this is the agenda, why we have to be aware whoever comes to the front, we have to at least query who is behind it. He said, "I wanted to find and groom a Messiah who would start out in Egypt and then spread his word to Africans and perhaps to other third world peoples. Our chosen one, our Mahdi, as was referred to elsewhere, I said should be able not only to arouse hopes but also turn them into the valid expectations and actually lead underprivileged peoples all over the world to a better health, better well-being, security, and above all freedom, and would at the same time immunise them against any false prophets." I mean, their prophets are not false, but this is the agenda, and the Americans and the British, and we've been very good at it over history, have always tried to find people that will lead the Muslims particularly and mislead them. So propaganda, public relations, and the media are very important. This is a headline that I was given again in Dubai. Now, can anybody tell me who all these people are? Anybody know who these people are?
Muslims that died on September the 11th.
Yes. One out of how many? Yes. Now, this is not the collateral damage, but of course this is the sort of propaganda that we should be pushing out. That it wasn't that Muslims also died as part of that, and it's abundantly clear that we haven't even started to address the balance. Hopefully we can. But it's going to be a long process, but we have to be prepared for a long ride. The sort of thing that we should be using, particularly, we've heard now the use of the word blitzkrieg in relationship to Jenin and what's happening in Israel. And people are saying, well, how is it possible that the Israelis who suffered in the Warsaw Ghetto could in actual fact do the same thing to other people? Well, bearing in mind that according to certain rabbinical views, 1 million Arabs being killed is not equal to one Jewish fingernail. So there is no mercy, because they're under certain ideas from the Talmud. Anybody other than the Jews themselves are considered to be subhuman, therefore they're expendable, and it is pleasing to God for them to be killed. Right. Very interesting. Now this is from the Jewish Chronicle. So hopefully we can't be accused of anti-Semitism, although there aren't many Semites in the Jewish Chronicle, they're mainly Ashkenazim. But look at this headline. See that? Okay? that's one. The most famous field marshal, Air Vice Marshal Milch, who was the deputy to Goering, and his mother was Jewish, and Goering said, I will determine who is Jewish and who is not. So here's the head of the Luftwaffe, the name, as with aerial bombardment or Ariel Sharon. This is the other aerial bombardment. But this is from the Guardian, not the Guardian, this is from the Daily Telegraph, I think, Telegraph. The middleman is an officer, a Jewish officer, Helmut Wilberg, who was the architect of the concept of Blitzkrieg. There you go. So his contribution to what happened and what's now happening in Israel came from a Jewish general in Hitler's army, blitzkrieging Jews in Warsaw. So this also is another famous general block. This one here, and many, there were 168 senior officers, generals and field marshals, Jewish origin, in the German army. Now, why haven't we seen that in any of the Arab news? Even in Al Jazeera, we haven't seen any of this coming out that we can say the treatment of Palestinians. If they can treat Jews then that way, then of course there's little hope for trying to reason with people like this. They have no sense of right and wrong. But we have only ourselves to blame. Or, when did we see this published in any Arab newspaper? This is not a million miles from here. This was a speech made by Chaim Weizmann on September the 21st, 1919, just round the corner. And this is what he was saying about Zionist policy to the British Zionist Federation. He said about the treatment of Arabs, he said, we cannot go into the country like Junkers, which is this policy of blitzkrieg, like the German army, but the Junkers were the shock troops. He said, we cannot go into the country like Junkers. We cannot afford to drive out other people. We who were driven out ourselves cannot drive out others. We shall be the last people to drive off the fella from his land. We shall have and establish normal relations between us and them. The Arabs will live amongst us. They won't suffer. They will live amongst us as the Jews do live here in England. That is our attitude towards the Arabs. Any other attitude is criminal, childish, impolitic, stupid. We've sent a copy of this to the Israeli embassy. Whether they read it or not, I don't know. But at least, it's the least we can do is say, this was, I think it was wrongly directed, but you should be reading it. Again, this is the sort of propaganda, and this is factual. It's not something that's been invented as they invent. These are things that have been said by people who they would recognize as the founders of Israel. Other things, this is also material that should be published. This is the Jewish Guardian. This is produced by rabbis or a group called Netura Carta, who you'll be aware of. And here we have an interesting picture of Rabbi Hirsch at the deathbed, basically, of the Sheikh Said al-Din Alami, who was the the Mufti of Jerusalem. And this is the closeness of this group of Jews who produce this sort of material. Genocide in the Holy Land is a book written by Rabbi Hirsch about the extermination of Israeli or Jewish children and the taking away of Yemeni children or from religious families and selling them to the the Ashkenazim families. So this is a book, a very important book that we're trying to get more copies of, and if necessary we're prepared to print it or get donations to print it. But this is the sort of propaganda, or not this is the sort of information. Rabbi Moshe Sonnenfeld made this quotation. He said, terrorism has also been the capstone of Zionism. One only needs to remember the tactics of the Irgun, of which Israel's current Prime Minister Menachem Begin was a member. Countless terrorist acts, such as those used in 1950 and 51 in Baghdad, Iraq, have been attributed to the Zionists. Terrorist acts not only against those opposed to Zionism, but also against their fellow Jews to persuade them to immigrate to Israel. all of these tactics, which most people would agree are despicable, were used, but the worst is the Zionist denial of the freedom of religious education and religious expression to their fellow Jews. Now, isn't that something that we should be quoting back at them and making sure that every Arab, every Islamic television channel is actually quoting, at least to do something? And this is what he also said about the being on the Temple Mount. According to the Torah, according to those who are conscious of what God actually said, they're saying that if it takes another 2,000 years to remain in diaspora, we should remain in diaspora until the Messiah comes. So they're saying whoever took us into Israel is against the interests of the Jewish people, because they will be punished severely for it. He said the Holy of Holies, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, has not been spared. For 2,000 years no Jew dared violate the prohibition of treading upon the sacred spot, until the Zionist state turned it into a tourist attraction and encouraged hundreds of thousands of Jews to defy the commandment of the Torah, punishable by death, koris. We tremble when we become aware of the meaning that the land spew you out, that which is offensive to it. We tremble because this has already been fulfilled several times in Jewish history. No less a crime is the abrogation of the Zionist state of the right to speak in the name of the Jewish people. That was in the Jewish Guardian in the winter of 1986. He said, tens of thousands of immigrant children have been forcibly torn from their religious roots. Jew or non-Jew, all of us who believe in religious freedom are aghast at what was perpetrated in the immigrant settlements of the Oriental Jews in the Zionist state against a youth whose innocence and pure religious sentiment was a poetic joy to behold. The Holy Land is being defiled by lawless laws enacted by the Zionist state, which encourage murder, abortion, promiscuity, women's conscription to the army, to name just a few. So this, inshallah, we're going to republish within the next week or so. And the Jewish Guardian, these are back copies, but they're like finding hen's teeth. But we have these and from some of the Natura Carta. And he is basically saying that we have no claim to the Temple Mount, and that he said here that Jews do not want in any way to take that which isn't theirs, and they certainly do not want to contest the rights of others and other inhabitants to the places held by them which they regard with honour and consider holy. And in particular, there is no foundation to the rumour that the Jews want to acquire the Temple Mount. On the contrary, from the time that because of our sins we were exiled from the land and our holy temple was destroyed, and we have been lacking the purity required by the Torah, it is forbidden for any Jew to set foot upon the ground of the Temple Mount until the coming of the righteous Messiah, Moshiach, with whom the Spirit of the Lord, which will hover over him, will rule righteously for the good of all creation. And we return to the purity required by the Torah. Now, I'm sure none of us have heard that issued on CNN or any of these things, but we hopefully will start to get these things out in our propaganda campaign. How I found this book was as a result of reading an article in which it was referred to, but I never saw the book until Muhammad Rafiq, who was here at the last meeting, who was sitting at the end, when I wrote this book, or I compiled the book, he challenged it on the basis, and then sometime later he provided us with a photocopy of the original of this, which he'd found, because he's a very good researcher. And why it's important that we start as Muslims who have Arabic obviously have the great advantage, but the great problem for us is that we have basically become very lazy in actually doing our own research. But there is a hadith, a very important hadith, which tells us about the events that are have led up to World War I, and would then lead to basically Yom Kippur. And in a very important book by Lady Queenborough called The Occult Theocracy, she published part of a letter from the head of British intelligence in Constantinople on May the 29th, 1910, from Sir Gerald Lowther to Sir Charles Harding here in London, in which he points out that the Young Turk Revolution, which had taken place on July the 8th, 1908, was basically conducted and carried out by 80,000 Spanish Jews from Salonika, who were Masonic, and carried out a coup d'etat and took control of Turkey in July 1908. The archives and now nearly 200 other publications that have been sent to me, I mean volumes and volumes about the Young Turk Revolution, all confirm what Sir Charles Harding was saying, in fact more. But his statement was to Sir Charles Harding in London shortly after the revolution in July 1908, when the committee was established in Constantinople. It soon became known that many of its leading members were Freemasons. It was also noticed that Jews of all colours, native and foreign, were enthusiastic supporters of the new dispensation till, as a Turk expressed it, every Hebrew became a potential spy of the occult Balkan Committee, and the people began to remark that the movement was rather a Jewish than a Turkish revolution. This event was predicted by Rasulullah in a hadith which is accepted because it's in the main collection of Sahih Muslim. And if we read from this, we will see precisely that Rasulullah's prophecies are always accurate. And there's another collection of hadith that has just been released by a sheikh from Al-Azhar, and it's a collection of hadith that they found somewhere in the archives in Al-Azhar, and it's called Armageddon, the Last Declaration to the Islamic Nation. It's been out about 4 or 5 weeks now. But if we want to really save ourselves, we have to go back to the future. This is what Rasulullah was saying. Now we know that he meant Constantinople because in 4 hadith he mentions the city by name, the city which parties on the sea, and this is reported by Abu Huraira. And Rasulullah said, alayhi salatu wasalam, "Have you heard of the city which parties on the sea?" Yes, they said, understanding him to mean Constantinople. He said, Yom Kippur, the last hour shall not occur till 70,000 children of Ishaq will attack it. But when they come, they will land down when they come to it, they will land down, but they will not fight with arms, nor shower it with arrows. They will simply declare there is no God but Allah, and Allah is the greatest. And one of its sides will be open, one of its doors. They will recite it for a second and a third time, and it will be open to them. They will enter into it. They will acquire the spoils of war. Then someone will say, verily, Dajjal, or Antichrist, has come out. And they will return. And in Mishkat al-Masavi, another accepted collection of hadith, the same hadith is reported in which Rasulullah adds 3 very important points. He said, within 6 years of this event, count 6 years, to Jihad Akbar, the Great War. Then after 1 year, miss 1 year, look to the emergence of Dajjal and revolution which enters every Arab house, followed by mutual hatred and hostility between the Arabs. Now, if we count 6 years from July 1908, I know all these accountants will be able to do that, it brings us to the year 1914, in which, if you look at any monument in this city or anywhere in the British Isles, or even the British Empire, as it was called Commonwealth now, but it's still the British Empire, the informal empire, you'll see that to the glorious dead fallen in the Great War. So the description of Rasul is used by us in Goristan and other parts west. This So July 1908, by the end of July, war is declared. We already have the printing of certain treasury notes to overcome the panic of the banks, but exactly within the 6 years specified by Rasulullah, the war begins. Then he says miss 1 year, so skip 1 year. And in the Times history of the war, the report of 1915 shows about in Arabia, there was no outward revolt in Arabia in 1915. The revolt begins by the July of the following year. Lawrence, that great liberator, Lawrence of Arabia, arrives, and of course from that point, as Rasulullah said, the fitna, the revolt, the Arabs became revolting, somebody said. But they started to revolt, and there's been no peace between them ever since. So every house, the contagion went into it. So the emergence of Dajjal is synonymous with the Lawrence of Arabia's arrival, and then the machinations that have gone on since. Now, we have also the benefit of the Masonic newspaper in Turkey for October 1908, and this is where the hair stands on end. It said a secret young Turk council was formed, and the whole movement was directed from Salonika. Salonika, the most Jewish town in Europe. 70,000 Jews out of a population of 100,000 was especially suited for the purpose. It already contained several Masonic lodges in which the revolutionaries could work without being disturbed. These lodges are under the protection of European diplomacy, and as the Sultan was without weapons, against them his fall was inevitable. On the 1st of May 1909, the representatives of 45 Turkish lodges met in Constantinople and found that the Grand Orient Ottoman Mahmud Oppi Pasha was nominated as Grand Master. So this we have from the insiders, and also, I say, the other 200 publications corroborate that this hadith is fulfilled to the day, and more besides. But if we have the sound, if we go by the hadith and we start now to address things, our propaganda should be on the basis of what Rasulullah said. We should be amongst ourselves, educating ourselves, and with the efforts of others, I think we'll achieve it, inshallah. But we don't have a lot of time. Apparently, according to the hadith, this collection, the Mahdi, or the final phase, there will be a major battle, and it looks like that Saddam will be killed and his son will take control, according to this, and then he will send the army to try and defeat al-Mahdi in Medina. So it seems to be that there are hadith that we haven't seen, but when you read them in the light of the other hadith that we have, it all adds up. Now, there is another part to this, which I also want to point out why it's important that we know who is who, or who was who. The Young Turk Revolution was financed from Wall Street. The money came from the Rothschild family, from Jacob Schiff, and the Abdul Hamid was kept in captivity in Salonika, in the house belonging to the banker Jacob Schiff. In 1927, a Masonic lodge was opened in Romania called the Jacob Schiff Lodge. But not only that, at the same time, remember what happens, 1917, the Balfour Declaration, October 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution begins. It's exactly the same firm doing the catering, if you like. We have here the founders of the Bolshevik Revolution. Only 16 Russians were in the government, all the rest were Jews from America. 388 members of the revolutionary government comprised of 16 Russians, and the rest were American Jews from the Lower East Side of New York. This was given in evidence by the Reverend George Simmons of the St. Petersburg Episcopal Church, who was there from 1907 to 1918. He said in December 1918, out of 388 members of the revolutionary government, only 16 happened to be real Russians. All the rest were Jews from, with one exception of a US Negro. All 265 came from the Lower East Side of New York. Such has been the condition of affairs in the USSR from that day to this. Though a number of Jews were liquidated in the so-called Moscow Purge, this affected the situation in no way. It merely signified that one Jewish faction had triumphed over another and liquidated it. There has never been anything by the nature of a Gentile revolt against the Jewish domination. Under Stalin, out of 57 members of his cabinet, 56 or 55 were Jewish, including his wife. So the whole thing, every head of every delegation, every ambassador, the whole thing, like with Turkey, since 1980 it's been an entirely Zionist government, and most of the members of the government are Donne, or they pretend to be Muslims, but in actual fact they come from this same group. So why there's an alliance between Israel and Turkey, we shouldn't be surprised. So their propaganda is that, of course, it's conspiracy theory, all this, and therefore we've got to say, well, of course, even if the prophet says it, we must believe them. But as Marx said, are you going to believe me or the evidence of your own eyes? Groucho, by the way. In a very important book, this called The Rothschild Money Trust, a very important book. This is what the declaration was by a man who was talking about the propaganda in the next war, and he knew Senator Nye very well. And he was saying how great it was. It has taken 22 years to find out the whole story of our betrayal into World War I, and we are indebted to Senator Nye of North Dakota for digging into the records and bringing to light the Balfour-Lansing correspondence. This was between Balfour and Lansing, the deal to cut how they were going to play the game. And he's saying here that by which President Wilson is shown to have agreed to enter the war long prior to the sinking of the Lusitania. In his tireless efforts to keep this country out of the war, Senator Nye discovered and revealed the truth and the real reason for President Wilson's change of front. Prior to this revelation, we thought we entered the war because of the sinking of the Lusitania and the violation of our rights as neutral. But it was not the real reason, as conclusively shown by the Balfour-Lansing correspondence. It was only a pretext to secure the support of Congress and the people. There can be no doubt about the fact that prior to President Wilson's second election in 1916, they used the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." And there can be no doubt that he was re-elected on that slogan. So why did he change his position soon after the election? And I just added here, just like George Bush, who said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and yet by the end of June 1990, he had changed his position. So why did Wilson make the agreement with the British government to help the Allies? That had until today now been an unexplained mystery. This is 1939 or 1940 when he's writing this. He said the answer is the Jews in Palestine. Believe it or not, President Wilson sacrificed 50,000 of the flower of our youth, caused 200,000 to be maimed and crippled, and gave away $50 billion of our wealth in order to restore Palestine to the Jews. A small barren country that could have been bought for $1 billion or less. But worse than that, he took us into the war for the purpose of treacherously taking the homeland from one of our own allies, the Arabs. Never have a brave, confiding people been so treacherously double-crossed. So that was the reason for World War I, World War II, and when I met Miles Copeland just on the eve of the Gulf War, and it was in the hospitality room at Carlton Television in Birmingham, I was introduced to him as the leader of the Islamic Party of Britain. And on my right was Christopher Monckton, who at that time was doing he was the leader writer for the London Evening Standard. And General Sir John Hackett was on the left. And so he said, "Okay, Dave," he says, "what's your take?" So I said to him, and I just read his book, part of it, so I was able to put the other bits together. So I said, the pretext for America entering World War I was the sinking of the Lusitania. The pretext for America entering World War II was the sinking of the fleet at Pearl Harbor. And the sinking of the US Kuwait is the pretext for occupying the Hijaz oil fields. Oh, you say, "Christ, we're going to have problems with you." But you're absolutely right. With that, Monckton spat his drink on General Hackett, who was here, and almost fell off his stool. But Copeland confirmed that was the game. So his book, The Game Play, The Game of Nations, are books that we should read to know how the propaganda game is played. Because unless we change, we're going to see things unravelling even more. So there's a lot more to discuss, but I think maybe, Mr. Chairman, I don't know how much time we've got. Maybe you want some questions?
I think what we'll do is start with some questions, and then we're going to break for Maghrib just around about 8 o'clock.
Okay.
So if you have any questions, can you please address them to the chair, and if you keep them short because we want to get as many people as possible. Yeah, brother there in the middle.
Alaikum salam.
Brother, you talked about making this effort and us creating awareness amongst ourselves or in the community. Isn't this the responsibility of our supposed leaders? So you mentioned Gamal Abdel Nasser. A lot of his brethren exist today amongst the Middle Eastern regimes. Supposedly rulers of the Muslim world are actually serving Uncle Sam. So is it like you mentioned? I mean, these people are not stupid. People who can disseminate or use propaganda or bring out muftis and scholars to justify attacks on other Muslim states. Can't they get this information and use this as a means of, creating awareness amongst the people, amongst the Muslims?
It's a very valid question. I think the answer to the problem is that the Rasulullah said this would happen, alayhi salatu wasalam, that the time would come when human blood would have no value, where riba would dominate, where the most corrupt person becomes the leader, the most worthless becomes the ruler. But we get the government we deserve, and Rasulullah also said that. We are aware, and of course it's been abundantly clear for a long time that as Moshe Dayan said, he said our first lines of defence are the Arab leadership. So we should be aware that they're not stupid. Unfortunately, we tend to, let hope overcome experience. It's no good as putting our heads in the sand and becoming hope addicts. It's required of us that we start. And the first thing, the thing that we could all do, and I'm not saying that I do it every day, but we should start, because when Rasulullah said, when the mosques are as full at Fajr as they are at Jummah, that's when you'll see the change. The defeat of Israel will happen. The hadith is explicit and very clear and after what people have seen now publicly on television, there's no disguising the fact what they've disguised in the past day. They've said that people have seen that they've bulldozed, they've actually exterminated in a blitzkrieg. So there will be no little or no interest in what's going to happen, and the prophecy is clear. When the Muslims, what does the hadith say? That the stones and the trees, except the boxthorn, will say, Ya Muslim, Ya Abdullah, come and kill this Yahud here behind me. But the thing is, it doesn't say Muslim, it says Ya Muslim, Ya Abdullah. So when we become Abdullah, we will liberate Al-Quds. If not, as somebody said, that Ariel Sharon had agreed to withdraw from the West Bank as soon as the Arabs withdrew from Marks and Spencer's on Oxford Street. But that's easy to do, so we should start with Marks and Spencer's Oxford Street. Yes.
You mentioned the Balfour Declaration. Because I've heard the view expressed that lawyers, especially Muslim lawyers, could get together and actually challenge the legality of the Balfour Declaration. Do you think this is something worth doing? Is it practical?
I think the only thing they fear is the use of the the use of law. As the American Indians have now just got a movement to actually sue the not the Sioux, but the Sioux are suing us, with the Blackfeet for the money that's been expropriated from them, from the Indian Affairs. They've defrauded them twice. They've nicked the land. And as Sitting Bull's son was asked when he said, "Well, what do you think about democracy?" He said, "Well, we still have our reservations." That was a great laugh. So the point is that I think the only thing is that they fear is the legal challenge. Maybe like Enron, the shredding of Arthur Anderson, which is interesting. I just added that, that might happen. But it seems that the only thing they fear is actually a war crimes trial, which is what happened today, wasn't it, in the UN, that they passed some rule, but America's trying to wheedle out of it, because the only thing they fear is actually having the bailiffs round, and as it's the rule of law, we have to get them on the issue of law. And when, as Rasulullah said, if Dajjal comes amongst you and I'm with you, I will argue with him on your account. But if I'm not, each must argue on his own. So the legal loophole, or the way to get them, is in the courts. and that's the only thing. Like Milosevic has faced, although Milosevic was just a pawn in the game of Patsy, it was really our way to get all the concessions of minerals and what have you in Bosnia-Herzegovina. But I do believe that that's the one way that they've got everybody is on legalities. It's the rule of law, not the rule of justice. So you've got to know the law. And any lawyers, because that's why I think there was another quip from one of the comedians who said that, how did you win the 6-Day War? He said, very easy. He said, got all the lawyers, all the accountants, all the bankers, and said, charge. And you know how those devils can charge. So maybe we have to use the same we have to use the same things. But the legal thing is, you can see why they don't want to be called in front of the court, because they'll be abandoned as soon as somebody's singled out. So, yes, we should know the law and become the masters at it. Sorry.
What you've said today, isn't the natural condition, the solution to our problems is that we need to affect our own regime change?
So we need a...
We need to affect our own regime change in respect of our leaders, the Arab leaders.
I think we've got to realise... it's important to realise that it's a bit like Austin Mitchell was saying about movements. He said the politicians will only move when the people force them to move. So it's up to us, actually, to... he said, passing wagons. The politicians will never start one, but they'll jump on a passing wagon. We've got to be clear that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. They probably know, and they know they haven't got to that position without knowing you can go so far. But even politicians here say clearly that they don't move without the people, hold me back sort of thing, and make it look as though I'm not really willing. But we've got to make the difference. And we can't keep playing this game, but you're right. But we must realise that they are between a rock and a hard place in many respects. So it's just to be supple, to be really clever at what we do, but actually use the things that we have to win the argument with the ammunition that's from their quarter. There's something I wanted to quote, and you've just reminded me of it. These are some points about the UN. Why the UN declarations, and Kofi Annan, the man who presided over Rwanda, is there pontificating today. I was almost sick. But Ben Gurion said in Time magazine in 1948, the United Nations is a Jewish ideal. Harry Klein, New York Jewish lawyer, he said the United Nations is Zionism. The United States Congressman James B. Utt said the United Nations has strict double standards which guide it through its devious, treacherous path to world domination. James Paul Warburg, the founder of the Federal Reserve, he said we shall have world government whether or not we like it. The only question is whether world government will be achieved by conquest or consent. Ramsey Clark, the former US Attorney General under Lyndon Johnson, said the greatest crime since World War II has been US foreign policy. And David Sharp, a former United States Marine Commander, 1966, said, I believe that if we had and would keep our dirty, bloody, dollar-soaked fingers out of the businesses of these third world nations, so full of depressed, exploited people, then they will arrive at a solution on their own. And if, unfortunately, their revolution must be of the violent type, because the haves refuse to share with the have-nots by any peaceful method, at least what they get will be their own, and not the American style, which we don't want, and which they don't want, and above all, they don't want cramming down their throats by Americans. So the ammunition is to also educate the leaders by trying whichever way we can to give them information, so they can recognise that when they're in a hole, they should stop digging. But it's not easy for them because they know that most of them are not prepared to be shaheed, so that's the other problem. And for the Zionists, as somebody said, the Zionist is a Jew who wants another Jew to go and live in Palestine. So, but you're right. But we have to be also realistic to say we must give them the opportunity to know that we're with them and we're in the mosque. Something we can do without them telling us. They see that they have to change, and they've got the strength and the confidence. So we must try as best we can.
Right, I think we'll leave it there for the moment. If we clear the chairs, and if someone can do the azan for Maghrib, and then we'll pick up back after Maghrib prayers.